I had the chance to teach through some of Jesus' parables of judgment recently. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is how deeply a first reading can embed itself in our imagination. In a lot of these stories, I tried to come at things with a slightly different angle, to think in new ways about what Jesus might be telling us. And what I've realized is it's really hard to get past our first impression of a story. Either the first way we read it or the first way that we were taught to interpret it. Even if the story, when looked at from a different angle, makes a lot of sense in a slightly different way, it's really hard for us to let go of that first reading. But I think that's the real beauty of a parable. Jesus chooses a particular genre. In Hebrew, it was called a mashal, a story that has multiple angles to it to force you to think about it, to do the work to understand it. Jesus could have just come straight out and told you what he wanted you to think, but he wants to draw that kind of work, that kind of investment out of you. And that's a deeply Jewish way of thinking about the truth. That the truth, when we've fought for it, the truth when we've wrestled with it, and when we've wrestled with each other for it, will actually impact us and shape us more deeply. I think this is exactly what Jesus wants us to do. That there are multiple ways to come at these stories. It's what's kept them alive and vibrant for millennia now. Now, that doesn't mean anything goes. Any interpretation of a parable that is outside the scope of Jesus' consistent teaching and ethic is obviously out of bounds. But there is a bandwidth within which we can imagine, we can dream, and we can think about these parables in really creative ways. That's the beauty of them. And so what I've tried to do is say, hey, maybe what you've heard isn't the only way to think about this. Maybe there's something here under the surface, on the slant, that can actually enliven you to new ways of thinking about God.
That leaves us with our conclusion. 5 get in, 5 are left outside. And the consensus seems to be that this is all about being well prepared, staying watchful, ready for Jesus to return at any moment, and if you don't, you can kick rocks outside while the rest of us party on the inside. And yet, the more I sit with this story, the more I wonder if maybe that interpretation has completely missed the point of it. Because look at what actually happens here. 10 bridesmaids are waiting for the party, and the groom is delayed. In fact, the delay stretches on into the evening, and so, rightly, they all become drowsy and fall asleep. That's verse 5. In fact, they all let their lamps burn out, and when the groom shows up, they all scramble to get the lights back on. Do you remember where the story started, right? Chapter 24, the disciples say, when will this happen? How will we know the sign of your coming? And initially, at least, we said that Jesus' answer was, you won't. But the more I sit with it, the more I'm starting to think that's only half the story. And maybe his real answer was, you won't, and the truth is, you're going to miss it anyway. You're all going to fall asleep at some point. So the more I sit with the story, the less I think it's about those of us who got it right, and I think it's about those of us who know that we're going to get it wrong. Jesus' real answer to his disciples' question of how are we going to know is the wrong question. Because nobody's getting into my party by the sweat of their brow, or the form of their character, or even the diligence of their watchfulness. That's just not how my parties work. No, my parties are for those who fall asleep and miss my arrival, those who let their lamps go out and deny me 3 times, those who betray me to my enemies and won't believe in my resurrection till they get to poke me in the side. And if you start to think that all those things matter, that you need to measure up, then maybe they will to you. Because if you think that way, you're probably going to live your life counting up your wins and losses and measuring out your oil to make sure there's just enough to get you home. Instead of realizing that your invitation never depended on your ability to read the signs anyway. It was only ever about trusting that I would be there to wake you up when the time was right. See, I think when we make peace with our limitations and we understand our inability to read the signs, when we plan for sleep to catch us eventually, what we realize is that the party was only ever about grace to begin with. And the only way to miss it is to think you can time it with your best efforts. Jesus isn't telling this story to judge the ability of his disciples to be ready. He's saying, you can't. You're all going to fall asleep anyway. And you're all going to be caught off guard by grace when it comes to find you. The judgment here is against our insistence that we could ever even be ready enough to warrant our inclusion in the celebration. Jesus is saying, stop trying to do just enough and start living as if you are absolutely convinced that the party is coming eventually.